I used to think my life was plain in a good way. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I woke up early, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, drove the same route to work, and came home at roughly the same time every night. My wife was usually there before me, or not long after. We had our routines, and I believed in them more than I believed in luck. Routines meant safety. They meant you knew where you stood. We'd been married for 12 years. Not the kind of marriage people write books about, but the kind most people actually live in. We knew each other's habits, moods, and silences. We didn't talk about everything, but we didn't fight much either. On weekends, we went to the grocery store together, complained about prices, argued lightly over what brand of bread to buy, then forgot about it by the time we got home. At night, we watched shows we half-liked and fell asleep on opposite sides of the couch. I thought that was normal. I thought that was what growing up looked like. She used to smile at me without thinking. Not a big smile, just a small one that showed she was comfortable. When she walked into a room and saw me there, her shoulders stayed relaxed. I noticed things like that because I liked noticing them. I liked believing I was paying attention. If I'm honest, I believed I was a good husband. I worked, paid bills on time, didn't drink too much, didn't run around. I remembered birthdays and anniversaries. I listened, or at least I thought I did. I never raised my voice at her. I never gave her a reason to doubt where I was or who I was with. I thought that counted for something. Looking back now, I see how confident I was in all of it. Too confident. I thought betrayal was something that happened in other houses, to other men. The kind of thing you hear about at work or read online and shake your head at. I remember thinking, more than once, that I was lucky. That my life might be boring, but it was solid. The first changes were so small they barely registered. She started coming home a little later. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing you'd build a theory on. She said traffic was worse, or she stopped somewhere on the way. I nodded and believed her because I wanted to. Belief is easy when it costs you nothing. Then she stopped telling me stories about her day. Not all at once. Just fewer details. Shorter answers. I told myself she was tired. I told myself work was stressful. Everyone goes through phases, I said. Marriage isn't a movie. I remember one evening standing in the kitchen, watching her scroll through her phone with a look I didn't recognize. Not happy, not sad, focused in a private way. When I asked what she was reading, she locked the screen without thinking and said, "Nothing important." The words were normal. The movement wasn't. I felt something then, like a light pressure in my chest. Not pain, more like a warning my body sent before my mind caught up. I ignored it. I was good at ignoring things that didn't fit the life I believed I had. That night, lying in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling and told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was what marriage looked like after enough years passed. Quiet, uneventful, safe. I held on to that word like it was a fact, not a hope. After that night, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not in a suspicious, dramatic way. More like I was double-checking things I used to accept without thought. I noticed how she kept her phone face down on the table. How she took it with her when she went to the bathroom, even if she was only going for a minute. She had always been casual about it before, leaving it wherever. Now it never left her reach. I told myself technology made people weird. I told myself everyone guarded their privacy more these days. Still, I couldn't unsee it once I noticed. Mornings changed too. She used to shuffle around half awake, hair messy, barely speaking until the second cup of coffee. Now she woke up earlier, showered right away, dressed with more care. Nothing flashy, just deliberate. She checked herself in the mirror longer than usual. When I teased her about looking sharp for work, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a distance that hadn't been there before. Not cold exactly, but careful, like she was measuring every word she said around me. When I reached for her hand while we sat on the couch, she let me, but her fingers didn't squeeze back. Small things. Always small things. One night, I asked her straight out if something was bothering her. I tried to keep my voice neutral, like I was asking about the weather. She looked surprised, then annoyed, then calm, all in the space of a second. She said she was fine, just tired, just busy. She said I was overthinking. I apologized for bringing it up. That part still bothers me. How quickly I backed down. How eager I was to smooth things over, even when something inside me was asking me not to. Days passed, then weeks. The changes didn't go away. They stacked up quietly. Less laughter, fewer shared moments. When I talked about my day, She listened politely, but her mind was somewhere else. I could feel it, like talking to someone who's already halfway out the door. I started replaying our past in my head, looking for signs I might have missed. I wondered if I'd done something wrong, if I'd gotten lazy or distant without noticing. I promised myself I'd do better. I cooked dinner more often. I asked more questions. I tried to be present in ways I hadn't thought about before. She noticed the effort. I could tell. She thanked me. She even hugged me sometimes, quick and careful, like she was borrowing time she didn't really have. Those moments confused me more than the distance. They gave me hope and took it away at the same time. One Friday evening, she said she was going out with coworkers. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how rehearsed it sounded, like she'd practiced saying it. She avoided my eyes while she spoke. I told her to have fun. I meant it, or I wanted to mean it. She didn't come home until after midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the dark living room. When she walked in, she looked startled to see me. She said her phone died. She said time got away from her. She kissed my cheek and went straight to bed. I stayed where I was for a long time after that. The house felt different. Too quiet. Too big. I remember thinking that something important had shifted, even if I couldn't name it yet. I still told myself I was imagining things. I still chose the version of reality that hurt less. But deep down, a part of me had already started preparing for something I wasn't ready to face. After that night, sleep stopped coming easily. I'd lie awake listening to her breathe, slow and even, and wonder how someone could look so peaceful while carrying something unspoken. I didn't think of it as betrayal yet. That word felt too heavy, too dramatic. I still believed there was an explanation that would make sense once I heard it. During the day, I caught myself checking the clock more often, wondering where she was, what she was doing. I hated that about myself. I'd never been a jealous man. I took pride in trust, in giving space. Now that space felt like a room I wasn't allowed to enter anymore. One afternoon, she left her phone on the kitchen counter when she stepped outside to take out the trash. It buzzed once. Then again. I froze. My first instinct was to look away, like I'd accidentally walked in on something private. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Just a first name. No photo. I didn't touch the phone. I just stood there, heart beating harder than it should have over something so small. When she came back in, she picked it up quickly, almost too quickly, and slipped it into her pocket. She smiled at me and asked if I wanted dinner early or late. Her voice was normal. That scared me more than if it hadn't been. I started noticing patterns. Certain nights, she was more distant than others. Certain days, she seemed lighter, almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted somewhere else before she came home. I told myself I was connecting dots that weren't there. That once you start looking for something, you'll always find it. I thought about asking her again, about pushing harder, but I was afraid of what the answer might be, and maybe more afraid of how it would change us even if it wasn't what I feared. There's a kind of fear that comes from knowing a question can't be taken back once it's asked. Instead, I turned inward. I replayed our early years together. How we met. How she laughed back then, loud and unguarded. How we used to talk about everything, even nothing, just to hear each other's voice. I wondered when that ease had slipped away, or if it ever really had, and I was just noticing now because I was scared. One evening, while we were eating dinner, she mentioned a man at work. Just in passing. A name I'd never heard before. She said it casually, like it didn't matter. I nodded and kept eating, but something tightened in my chest. I wanted to ask more. What did he do? How often did they work together? Instead, I asked if the chicken was okay or too dry. That was the moment I realized how much I was censoring myself. How careful I'd become, like the goal was no longer honesty, but stability. I was managing my own thoughts the way you manage a fragile object, afraid that one wrong move would shatter everything. That night, she fell asleep before me. I lay there, staring at the faint outline of her in the dark, and felt a quiet grief I couldn't explain. Not for something that had happened, but for something that was slipping away while I watched. I didn't know yet how far it would go, only that whatever was changing between us wasn't stopping on its own. And for the first time, I admitted to myself, in a voice so low it barely felt real, that there might be another man somewhere in the space she used to save for me. After I admitted that thought to myself, I tried to push it back down. I went through my days like nothing had changed, but everything felt slightly off, like a picture hanging crooked on the wall. You can ignore it for a while, but you always know it's there. I started noticing how careful she was with time, how certain evenings were suddenly off limits. how plans were made quickly and explained even quicker. If I asked follow-up questions, she answered them smoothly, but there was no warmth in it. Just efficiency, like she was closing a door. I told myself that if there really was someone else, I'd feel it more clearly, that there would be signs too obvious to miss. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it whispers instead of shouting. One Saturday morning, we went grocery shopping together. It should have felt normal. We walked the aisles, filled the cart, argued lightly about buying things we didn't need. But I felt like a guest in my own marriage. She moved ahead of me, checked her phone while I compared prices, smiled at something on the screen, and then caught herself and went neutral again. I pretended not to notice. At the checkout, the cashier asked if we were having a good day. She said yes without looking at me. That small moment stayed with me longer than it should have. It felt symbolic in a way I couldn't explain yet. Later that afternoon, I suggested we take a drive, just the two of us. Something we used to do when we needed air. She hesitated, just a second too long. Then she said she had a headache and wanted to stay home. I said okay. I always said okay. While she rested in the bedroom, I sat in the living room and tried to read. I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling the same place. I wondered if she was texting someone while I sat a few rooms away. I hated that thought. I hated that I was becoming someone who thought that way. That evening, she seemed better. Too better. Cheerful in a way that didn't match the headache story. She suggested ordering takeout. We ate on the couch, watching a show neither of us really followed. She laughed at the right moments. She leaned against me. From the outside, we probably looked fine. But when I put my arm around her, her body tensed for just a moment before relaxing again. It was subtle, but it was there. My stomach dropped. I didn't move. I didn't want to make it worse. That night, lying next to her, I realized how lonely I felt with someone right beside me. It was a new kind of loneliness. Not loud or sharp, but steady. The kind that sinks in slowly and stays. I told myself I needed proof before I let my mind go any further. That I owed her that. That I owed myself that. Still, some part of me already knew I was past the point where proof would change how this felt. I fell asleep thinking about how easy it used to be to trust her, and how hard it suddenly was not to question everything. The idea of proof sat with me longer than I expected. It wasn't that I wanted to catch her doing something wrong. I just wanted clarity. The not knowing was wearing me down in ways I didn't know how to explain. I felt tired all the time, even on days when nothing happened. I started coming home a little earlier when I could. Not to spy, not exactly. Just to see. Sometimes she wasn't there yet. Sometimes she was, moving around the house like everything was normal. On those days, I almost felt foolish for doubting her. One evening, I walked in and heard her laughing in the kitchen. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard in a while. For a split second, I felt relief. Then I realized she was on the phone. She saw me, turned away slightly, and lowered her voice. When she hung up, she said it was a friend from work. I nodded. I didn't ask which one. That night, I dreamed I was standing outside my own house, looking in through the window. I could see the lights on, see movement inside, but I couldn't hear anything. I woke up with my heart racing. Dreams have a way of telling the truth when you're trying not to. A few days later, I noticed something small but concrete. A charge on our credit card I didn't recognize. Not a big amount. Just enough to stand out. A restaurant across town, one we'd never been to together. I stared at the statement longer than I should have. I told myself it could have been a work lunch. A team thing. People use cards for all kinds of reasons. When I mentioned it casually, she barely reacted. She said she must have gone there with coworkers and forgotten to tell me. Her answer came too fast. She didn't look up from what she was doing. I said okay. Again. After that, the distance felt heavier. Not louder, just heavier. Like the air in the house had thickened. We moved around each other carefully, like people sharing space without sharing much else. I thought about checking her phone. The idea made me uncomfortable. It felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. I'd always believed trust was a choice you made, not something you monitored. But I also felt like trust was already slipping away, whether I acted or not. One night, she fell asleep before me again. Her phone was on the nightstand, screen dark. I stared at it longer than I'm proud of. My hand even moved toward it, then stopped. I pulled it back like I'd touched something hot. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, realizing that even without proof, something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of who I was becoming in the process of looking for it. After that night, I stopped pretending things would go back on their own. I didn't confront her, but I also didn't relax anymore. I lived in a kind of quiet alertness, like I was waiting for something to happen without knowing when or how. She started spending more time away from home. Not dramatically more, just enough to feel intentional. Errands took longer. Workdays stretched into evenings. When she talked about her schedule, it sounded rehearsed, like she was following a script she'd memorized. I noticed how rarely she asked about mine. One afternoon, she told me she had a work event the following week. Dinner, maybe drinks after. She said it casually, but she didn't look at me when she said it. I asked where it was. She named a place and immediately followed it with, "I might be late." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't say anything that would make the moment heavier than it already was. That week felt endless. Every small interaction seemed loaded. When she smiled, I wondered why. When she didn't, I wondered more. I started realizing how exhausting it was to live inside constant interpretation. Every word, every pause, every movement felt like something I had to decode. The night of the work event, I came home to an empty house. I made myself dinner, ate it standing at the counter, and washed the plate right away. I didn't want dishes left over, like evidence of time passing. I sat on the couch and watched a show without following the plot. I checked the clock more than I should have. She texted once to say she'd be late. No details, just late. I replied with a thumbs up. It felt easier than typing words I didn't trust myself to mean. Midnight came and went. I told myself to go to bed. I didn't. When I heard her keys in the door, I felt a mix of relief and dread so strong it made me lightheaded. She came in quietly, like she hoped I'd already be asleep. When she saw me sitting there, she paused for half a second. Just enough. She smiled and asked why I was still up. I said I couldn't sleep. That part was true. She smelled different. Not bad. Just unfamiliar. Like a place I hadn't been. I noticed it immediately and hated myself for noticing. She kissed my cheek and said she was exhausted. She went straight to the bathroom, then to bed. I stayed where I was long after the lights were off. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not into anger. Not yet. Into a kind of dull certainty. I didn't know the details. I didn't have proof I could point to. But I knew I was no longer imagining things. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head anymore. The certainty didn't bring relief. It brought weight. Once a thought settles in that deep, it colors everything. The next morning, I watched her move around the kitchen like she always had, and it felt like I was seeing a double exposure. The woman I knew, and another version I couldn't quite place, layered on top of each other. She talked about her plans for the day. Normal things. Errands, emails, a meeting she didn't seem excited about. I nodded in the right places. I answered when spoken to. From the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, I felt like I was holding something fragile and heavy at the same time. I went to work and barely got anything done. I stared at my screen, reread the same email over and over, forgot why I'd opened certain files. Every quiet moment filled itself with images I didn't want. Not graphic ones. Worse, ordinary ones. Her sitting across from someone else, smiling the way she used to smile at me. That night, we ate dinner together again. She asked about my day, like she remembered she was supposed to. I told her it was fine. She said hers was busy. We cleared the table in silence. I noticed how practiced we'd become at that. I thought about confronting her then. About saying something simple and direct. I even rehearsed it in my head. But when I looked at her, really looked, I saw something like distance mixed with resolve. Not guilt. Not fear. Something firmer. And I realized that if I asked, I might not like the calmness of the answer. A few days later, something finally cracked the surface. I came home earlier than expected and heard her in the bedroom, talking on the phone. I stopped in the hallway without meaning to. I wasn't trying to listen. I just did. Her voice was low, softer than it ever was with me anymore. She laughed quietly and said, I know. There was a pause. Then she said, I'll figure it out. Not angry. Not rushed. Comfortable. I stepped back before she noticed me. I sat in the car for a while, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. I didn't feel shocked. I felt tired. Like I'd been carrying this moment with me for weeks, and now it had finally caught up. When I went inside, she was alone in the living room. She looked up and smiled like nothing had happened. I smiled back. It felt like a reflex I hadn't learned how to shut off yet. That night, lying awake again, I realized I was standing at the edge of something whether I wanted to or not. I could keep pretending, keep smoothing things over, keep swallowing questions. or I could step forward and accept whatever came with it. I didn't decide anything yet, but for the first time, I stopped telling myself I was wrong. Once I stopped telling myself I was wrong, the world didn't explode the way I'd imagined it might. It just grew quieter, heavier, like the volume had been turned down on everything except my own thoughts. I began to notice how little we actually talked anymore. Not arguments, not serious conversations, just real talk. We exchanged information, not feelings. Schedules, reminders, groceries. We lived like roommates who knew each other's history too well to pretend it wasn't there. I started taking longer walks after work. Not because I enjoyed them, but because the house felt tight when I got home. On those walks, I thought about what I would say if I finally asked her the question. Every version sounded either too weak or too aggressive. I couldn't find the middle ground. One evening, she told me she was going to a friend's place. She didn't say which friend. She didn't offer details. I didn't ask. When the door closed behind her, I sat at the kitchen table and realized I didn't know how long I could keep doing this. I didn't follow her. I didn't check her location or call anyone. Instead, I sat there with my hands flat on the table and felt the slow burn of something I'd been avoiding. It wasn't jealousy anymore. It was grief. Grief for a version of my life I'd thought was settled. When she came home later that night, she looked relaxed. Not guilty, not defensive, just settled. She told me she was tired and went to bed. I watched her disappear down the hallway and understood that whatever was happening elsewhere, it was giving her something she no longer found here. The next day, I found one of her earrings in the car, not on the seat, tucked into the small compartment near the door. I held it between my fingers for a long time. It was such a simple thing, something you could explain away if you wanted to. I realized I was done explaining things away. That evening, I placed the earring on the kitchen counter where she couldn't miss it. I didn't say anything. I just watched her face when she saw it. Her expression changed, just slightly. Not panic. Recognition. She picked it up, looked at it, then at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said she must have dropped it earlier. Her voice was steady. Too steady. I nodded. The nod felt different this time. Final in a way I hadn't felt before. That was the moment I understood I didn't need a confession to know the truth. What I needed now was the courage to face it. After that night, I stopped pretending the house was the same place I'd known for years. Every corner, every quiet hallway felt charged, like it held secrets I'd always trusted were mine to know, but weren't. I moved through it carefully, taking in the small changes I'd ignored before, her scent on clothes that weren't mine, subtle adjustments in the way she arranged the living room, the way she carried herself when I was in the same room. I kept busy at work, but my focus was gone. Emails, meetings, calls, they blurred together. I remembered laughing about this once, how easy it was to separate work and life. Now, I was always half in one place and half in another. Half at home, worrying about what she might be doing, half here, trying not to implode under the weight of certainty. One Friday evening, she said she needed to run errands, but her tone suggested she knew I wouldn't challenge it. I nodded, said okay, and watched her leave. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I had stopped pretending that ignorance would protect me. It wouldn't. When she came back, I noticed she was quieter than usual. Not apologetic, not defensive, just quiet. She went straight to her room and closed the door. I felt a twinge of frustration, then a deeper, slower ache. It wasn't anger at her anymore. It was mourning for the life I thought we shared. That night, I sat on the couch with the TV on, not watching, just listening to the hum of the background. I thought about the early days, how easily we trusted each other, how safe we felt in each other's presence. I remembered the laughter, the careless conversations that carried into the night. Now, those memories were distant, like they belonged to someone else. I tried to talk to her the next day, carefully, asked how she slept, how her day had gone. She answered, but the words felt rehearsed. Polite, neutral. I wanted warmth, something that said she remembered us, but it wasn't there. Not anymore. By midweek, I realized the weight of this quiet distance was crushing me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't confront her yet, not directly, not without a plan, but I also couldn't ignore it. Every passing hour made the truth more undeniable, and my silence longer and heavier. I found myself revisiting the same mental crossroads over and over. Do I confront her? Do I wait for her to confess? Do I act as if nothing has changed and hope it doesn't get worse? Each option felt hollow. Each one carried its own kind of pain. That night, As I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and accepted something I hadn't before. The trust one once had was gone. I didn't need her confession to know it. I didn't need proof. I just needed to recognize the truth I'd been tiptoeing around for weeks. And now, facing it head on, I felt the first real ache of what was to come. The next few days were a blur of small observations and quiet dread. I started noticing things I'd ignored before, things that didn't make sense when pieced together. Little inconsistencies in her stories, shortened explanations, pauses when I asked harmless questions, the way she'd glance at her phone and immediately put it away. Each of these tiny things was like a pinprick, small, almost unnoticeable alone, but together they started to bleed into everything else. I tried to convince myself that maybe it wasn't what I feared. Maybe I was overreacting. I told myself I was reading too much into her behavior. But the more I tried to reason it away, the clearer the picture became. I couldn't escape it anymore. One night, I came home earlier than usual, thinking maybe I'd catch her in a normal moment, something to reassure myself. I walked in, and she was there, sitting on the couch, pretending to scroll through her phone casually. But her body told a different story, rigid, careful, aware that I was watching. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But my gut wouldn't let me lie to myself anymore. We ate dinner in silence that night. Not uncomfortable, not explosive, just silence stretched thin across the table. I asked about her day. She answered. I nodded. I didn't press. I couldn't. Something inside me had already shifted. I was no longer willing to live in the pretend world we had created together. A week later, I found another small piece of evidence. A receipt tucked into her bag, one that didn't make sense. I didn't confront her right away. I put it aside, but the thought gnawed at me, persistent. Every time I saw her, every time she smiled, every time she laughed, an echo of that receipt lingered in the back of my mind. It became impossible to separate the woman I knew from the woman I suspected. I started avoiding questions. Not because I didn't care about the truth, but because I feared the answer. Facing it meant change, and change was something I wasn't ready to handle. But ignoring it didn't make the fear go away. It just followed me quietly, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The tension between us grew, subtle but heavy. We moved around the house like strangers. I found myself double-checking things before speaking, measuring every word, every glance. I realized that the person I once trusted implicitly now carried a weight I couldn't touch without risking it collapsing. And yet, life went on. Work continued, errands got done, bills were paid. Everything looked normal on the surface. But beneath it, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer living with the woman I thought I knew. I was living with someone else, someone distant and careful, and I had no idea if I would ever recognize her again. By this point, I had stopped pretending I didn't know. I wasn't blind anymore, and I wasn't hoping. I was simply observing, waiting for the moment when the reality we both lived in would become unavoidable. Every interaction felt like walking on a narrow bridge over a deep, dark chasm. One misstep, and everything would tumble down. I began to notice the small, almost imperceptible signs of affection she reserved for someone else. Not open, not obvious, just the subtle changes in her voice, the fleeting expressions, the way she lingered on messages before responding. Each one was like a quiet reminder that my place had shifted, that I no longer had exclusive access to her thoughts, her attention, her time. We continued our routines, but they were hollow now. Grocery shopping, cooking, watching TV, they felt like rehearsals for a life that no longer existed. I tried to fill the silence with words, small talk, questions about her day, but the answers were automatic, empty, rehearsed. It was like speaking to a shadow that resembled someone I loved. One evening, she suggested we go out for dinner. I agreed without thinking. The restaurant was familiar, the kind we used to frequent. I watched her interact with the waiter, order food, and laugh softly at something I couldn't hear. She seemed at ease in public, flawless, but there was a distance I couldn't cross. It wasn't the place, it was her. I realized then that she had already crossed somewhere else, emotionally, and I was just watching from the other side. After dinner, we drove home in silence. Not the comfortable silence of people at ease with each other, but the heavy, careful silence of two people who used to know everything about each other and now were strangers. I wanted to ask questions, to press, to find clarity, but the fear of what I might hear kept me mute. When we got home, I watched her move around the house with that practiced ease, that subtle vigilance. She didn't realize I was watching, but I couldn't stop. It was like a compulsion, a way to anchor myself in a world that no longer made sense. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't help it. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I understood something I hadn't before. The person I married wasn't entirely gone, but the version I loved, the version I trusted, was buried somewhere beneath layers of choices, secrets, and decisions she had made without me. And I realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that there was no going back to the way things were. I would have to live with this knowledge, quietly, and figure out who I was in a life that had irrevocably changed. By the time I reached that point, I had stopped pretending entirely. I no longer searched for signs or tried to rationalize away my instincts. I knew. The quiet certainty had settled into me like a permanent resident, and I couldn't shake it even if I wanted to. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about accepting a reality I had tried to avoid for months. We moved through the house like shadows, side by side, but separate. Conversations were minimal. Touches were mechanical. Smiles were polite. It felt as though we were performing the motions of a marriage without the substance. I realized that trust wasn't something I could restore by being careful or attentive. It was gone, and nothing I did could bring it back. One night, she fell asleep beside me, breathing steady and calm. I watched her, felt the distance, and allowed myself to grieve. Not for what she had done, but for the life we once had, the intimacy, the comfort, the effortless ease. I mourned the reality of who she had become to me, and who I had become trying to live with it. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild myself quietly. Not our marriage, not her, but me. I started taking walks alone, spending time on things I had neglected, trying to anchor myself in a sense of identity outside of this fractured relationship. It wasn't easy. Every habit, every memory, every shared glance reminded me of what I had lost. But it was necessary. Survival, I realized, required a new kind of focus. Occasionally, she tried to reach across the distance, small gestures, a question, a casual touch, but I no longer met them with the same certainty. I accepted them politely, gently, but with a guardedness I hadn't known I could sustain. I learned to separate presence from intimacy, to acknowledge someone's existence without assuming shared ownership of their heart or attention. Eventually, I understood the simplest, most painful truth. Life doesn't stop for betrayal, and neither does time. People continue to exist in parallel orbits, sometimes intersecting, sometimes not. I could not undo her choices, nor could I control the past or the moments she had shared elsewhere. All I could do was recognize the boundaries, protect my own mind, and navigate forward with the knowledge I had gained. It was not a story of revenge, reconciliation, or closure. It was a story of endurance, adaptation, and quiet acceptance. I woke up each morning, made coffee, went to work, came home. The routines remained, but the meaning had changed. I was no longer a man who trusted blindly, but a man who knew the value of his own attention, the weight of silence, and the cost of believing in a version of life that never truly existed. And in that, I found something fragile but real, a version of peace built not on illusion or denial, but on clear-eyed acceptance of the life before me, and the life I would continue to build, alone if necessary, with the lessons that betrayal had unwillingly taught me.